The letter arrived on a Tuesday, folded twice and slid under my apartment door. No stamp, no seal, not even my name. The paper was heavy, textured like old stationery, and it carried the faintest scent of salt and smoke. When I pinched the fold and lifted, my fingers came away dusted with something gray, like ash ground fine. For a minute I just stood there in the hall, keys still dangling from the lock, listening to the building's dim lungs, the elevator cables thrumming behind the shaft, Mrs. Kent's television leaking laughter through the wall, and beyond it all the shallow city hum. Nothing moved, no footsteps retreated, no prankster's suppressed giggle. Inside my apartment, the letter lay alone on the kitchen island like a white animal that had wandered in. I could have ignored it. I could have slid it into a drawer and let the mysteries starve. Instead, I unfolded it. There were only 7 words. Do not let the house inhale you. No signature. No address. No explanation. I read it twice, then a third time, tasting each word like I might taste a bitterness to prove a warning harmless. Do not let the house inhale you. The sentence brushed something old in me, an echo of a story from childhood about a cottage that swallowed ocean fog and, with it, sailors. But that was a campfire story, an uncle's whiskey shadow thrown against the tent. My phone buzzed. A calendar reminder flashed. Sable Street walkthrough to 2 p.m. I'd booked it yesterday after the property manager, a man with a voice like gravel, finally returned my 6th call. It was a freelance job. Evaluate a foreclosed house for a small production studio that wanted to shoot a low-budget thriller somewhere authentically haunted. Not with ghosts, exactly, but with a personality that unsettled the lens. I picked up the letter and held it to my nose. Salt? Smoke? Beneath that, maybe damp stone? I slid it back into its fold and tucked it into my messenger bag beneath. My camera, a notebook to spare batteries, and the tiny digital recorder I take everywhere because sometimes rooms say more when you aren't asking them to. I told myself the letter was a prank, an odd one, maybe orchestrated by the same studio to put me in the right mood. Still, when I locked my door, I double-checked the knob. Sable Street runs like a seam through a part of the city that developers forgot to finish. You can see where money started and stalled. Fresh sidewalks cracking to accommodate stubborn roots. Modern streetlights blinking over old brick buildings scabbed with graffiti. The house sat halfway down the block. A 3-story Victorian with a widow's walk and fish scale shingles the color of bruised plums. The porch bowed as if it had been breathing shallowly for 100 years. The key waited in a lockbox. When I reached for it, a wave rolled up from the harbor to streets over, carrying a tense that felt familiar. Salt and smoke. Not wood smoke. Not exactly. Something like a wick snuffed by an impatient mouth. Inside, the air was cooler than the afternoon warranted. The foyer smelled faintly of damp books and iron. Light fell in tall, hollow slats through the lace of a ruined curtain. Every surface was skinning over with dust until, in the stairwell, I saw streaks where someone's hand had dragged along the banister recently, clearing a dark human-width path. I tried to tell myself it was the bank's inspector, or the property manager, or the winder. Somehow, "Hello," I said, "because you always say hello to empty rooms, so that if someone answers, you can tell yourself you weren't surprised." No one answered. I propped the front door open with a broken umbrella from the porch basket habit. Precaution, or maybe superstition. Houses like this make you think about exits. I set the recorder on the hall table and clicked it on. A soft, red light began its steady metronome. I prefer having a room's first silence captured, in case later I need to prove it wasn't. In the parlor, wallpaper sloughed down the walls in long, curled tongues. A chandelier hung from a chain like a drowned thing. Someone had rolled up the rug as if making way for movement of furniture or bodies. The floorboards had that old house voice. They complained in sentences, not squeaks, as if translating pressure into language. I framed a few still photographs, wide-shot window light slashing the dust, detail of a cracked mirror blooming a spider web around an empty nail. The mouth of the fireplace, black-lipped, behind me. A draft combed the back of my neck. The front door, I thought. The umbrella wedge could have slipped. I went to check, but when I peered down the hall, I could still see sunlight and a rectangle of sky. The door stood open. The umbrella braced like a loyal dog. I told myself to stop cataloging every little anxiety. I've worked in enough abandoned spaces to know how they breathe. Settle, sigh, resist. It's natural to feel watched when a house has so many holes to see through. In the kitchen, an antique stove slouched between two counters that had separated from the wall, leaving a dark gap like a pulled tooth. The back door had been sealed with a sheet of plywood. Its nails had bled rust in fine vertical lines, descending like tally marks. I took photos. The recorder ticked off minutes. I wrote, "Back door sealed, rust lines equals water ingress." When I turned to leave, I noticed something I had missed upon entering. A second door tucked behind a curtain of peeling wallpaper, its outline traced faintly where the paste had failed to adhere. The knob was small and porcelain, with a hairline crack that looked like a comma. I pressed my ear to it. Nothing. The letter in my bag scraped itself against my shoulder blade like a cat pressing to be remembered. "Do not let the house inhale you." I twisted the knob. The door opened onto a narrow flight of stairs angling down into the dark. The smell rose first, a deeper note of the same salt and smoke, richer now, almost sweet, like karma left on the burner too long. I angled my phone's flashlight and saw brick walls damp with condensation, a ribbon of water gleaming along the edge of each step. "Basement," I said aloud, because naming things makes them smaller. Halfway down, the air changed. It pressed. The kind of pressure you feel at the bottom of a pool, or inside a crowded elevator when everyone decides not to breathe at once. My ears clicked, the recorder's tiny red eye, snug in my shirt pocket now, kept pulsing. And in that pulse I heard, or imagined, a shadow rhythm a second beat slightly off the first, like a house thudding its heart out of time. At the bottom, the stairs opened into a low room, ribbed with beams. Someone had chalked lines along the floor, concentric circles inscribed with symbols that looked older than the plaster but younger than the dust. Candles had been arranged at intervals along the circles and then burned down 2 puddles of wax hardened into a little archipelago. In the center, a rectangle of wood lay like a trapdoor without a frame. My mouth went dry. I'm not superstitious, but there is a difference between a place that people have forgotten and a place that people have asked not to remember. I crouched near the wax. There was grit in it. Sand, salt, black flecks like soot. The wick nubs were twisted, as if wrists had. I framed a shot, held my breath to keep my hands steady. The floor creaked behind me. A single long complaint. I straightened too quickly, and the room reeled. The chalk circles swam in the drifting beam of my phone's light. I saw movement in the far corner, nothing substantial, just the suggestion of a shoulder retreating. "Hello," I said, and immediately wished I hadn't. Silence, enormous. The pressure in my ears climbed. I looked up at the beams and saw that someone had hammered short nails into them, every foot or so nails from which hung strings, and from those strings, small paper shapes. They looked like labels from a library each, one the length of a thumb. They swayed, though there was no draft. I went closer, careful on the chalk. The first label read, "Inhale." The second, "Exhale." The third, "Listen." I stood perfectly still, and the house stood perfectly still with me. The only sound was the recorder's tiny heartbeat, and beneath it a faint return that might have been the bloat of the harbor pushing against the seawall, or might have been the house learning the word I had just read. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I wanted to prove I was still joking. Maybe the letter had wrinkled a nerve I couldn't smooth. I raised the recorder and spoke softly. "This is Avery Lane," I said. "Sable Street property. Basement appears to contain ritual markings. Someone has." I hesitated. The word was wrong, but it insisted. Hung instructions from the beams. The phone's light flickered just once, and the pressure in my ears popped in a sharp, painless click. The labels continued to sway, obedient to a wind I could not feel. When I backed toward the stairs, my heel slid on the water that had beaded along the step lip. I caught myself on the wall and felt the cold of the brick through my jacket, a temperature slow and ancient. The letter in my bag shifted again, reminding me of its weight out of proportion to its size. "Do not let the house inhale you." I made the mistake of looking up through a gap between the beams. Directly above the chalk circles was a rectangle of the parlor floor. I could see the underside of the rug roll. The burlap slumped like a sleeping thing, and for a second, less than a second, something leaned over that gap from above. Not a face, not exactly an outline, the shape of a person who had learned unknowability too well. It leaned and withdrew, the way a building leans into wind and then remembers itself. I climbed the stairs without running. Running in old houses is a good way to introduce your teeth to their floors. In the kitchen, the light had shifted. Afternoon had moved into a more serious hour. I closed the basement door and pressed the porcelain knob into my palm until the crack stung. The house exhaled. I swear it did. The curtains lifted and fell. The chandelier clicked in its chain. Every room for a heartbeat felt fractionally bigger, as if releasing something it had held. Then all was still. I wanted the front door. I wanted this sun, this stupid chatter of sparrows in the hedges, the ugly sincerity of street traffic. I walked the hall, and for the first time, I noticed the wallpaper pattern clearly. Tiny white lungs repeated endlessly, each pair twined with a vine. Where the paper had peeled, the lungs wrinkled and gaped. The rectangle of sky at the front was still there. So was the umbrella, faithful and foolish. I stepped onto the porch and let the air wash me. The harbor's brine, the city's burnt sugar exhaust, it smelled like life. Which is to say, it smelled like mistakes you could fix. I sent a text to the studio. Location viable. Strong atmosphere. Structural concerns. Minimal on first pass. We'll send photos and note. This was true, in the way a knife is truly metal. I wrote a second message to the property manager. I need the house to myself tomorrow. Can you confirm no one else has access? He replied almost immediately. Only you and me have the code. Bank inspector hasn't been back since April. Then, you find something? I stared at the screen, fingers hovering. Just a basement that wants to be interesting, I typed. A minute later, he wrote. Basement was sealed after last tenants. Should still be. I looked at the umbrella wedged in the doorway, felt the cool track of sweat down my spine. The word sealed felt like a hand on the back of my neck, pushing me gently toward the door. I closed the umbrella, shut the door, and turned the deadbolt. The house liked that, I could tell. Some buildings crave locked mouths. On Sable Street, sheets in an upper window across the way breathed out and in. A gull laughed on the telephone pole, a sound too human not to be unkind. I walked to my car, repeating the letter S, sentence in my head, like a dumb charm. Do not let the house inhale you. Do not. When I slipped behind the wheel, I realized my hands were shaking. I set the recorder on the passenger seat, rewound, and listened, footsteps mine creaking the foyer. The click of the umbrella finding purchase. My own breath, 2 measures faster than usual. Then, faintly, under the parlor's silence, a noise I hadn't heard while I was there. A long, slow draw. The kind you make when you're smelling a pot to see if it's ready. The sound traveled through the bones of the house the way a secret travels through a family. On the recording, the paper labels knocked together once and then were still. I told myself it was the wind through the chimney, a vacuum effect. An old house clearing its throat. At the end of the track, just as I was climbing the basement stairs, a voice spoke so softly that if I weren't me, I might have missed it. 2 words, almost kinder than warning. Not yet. I stopped the playback. My reflection in the dark screen looked like someone I owed an explanation. Salt and smoke clung to the back of my tongue, as if I had been breathing through another person's mouth. On the drive home, I passed the harbor where the water shouldered the old pilings. The sky morgue sheeted itself in early evening cloud. I rolled down the window to prove that air still worked the same everywhere. And the smell that found me was exactly the smell of the letter. Back in my apartment, I laid everything out on the kitchen island. Camera, notebook, recorder, The folded page, I unfolded it again, certain now that I would see more another line emerging like ink from lemon heat. Nothing. Only the 7 words. But on the back, invisible under the bright light of morning. A watermark bloomed now in the dusk. A little square of lines like a map fragment. Streets. An intersection. A tiny mark, like an X in the margin. Barely there. Someone had written with the pressure point of a pen that had run out of ink. When it inhales, something leaves with the breath. My sink faucet coughed once and released a thread of water that ran longer than it should have, like a vein that had learned disobedience. I shut it off harder than necessary. The pipes ticked in the wall. That night, when I finally slept, I dreamt of the basement, but the chalk circles were gone. In their place was a tide pool under a roof of beams, studded with starfish that pulsed as if with hungers. Each time the house breathed in, the pool sank, exposing black stones and little knife-bright shells. Each time it breathed out, the pool rose, and faces surfaced in the water the way coins do when wishes fail. I woke at 3:03 a.m. to the sound of paper moving. The letter, shifting where there was no draft. I told myself not to look. Then I looked. It lay exactly where I had left it, but in the dark its edges had curled more tightly, as if it were bracing for a weather only it knew. On the recorder, I cued a blank track and said into the night, I want tea. Go back. The room listened, and the room understood I was lying. Morning came with the ordinary miracle of coffee. I put on black clothes because you can tea-stain what is already the color of aftermath. At 1:45, I locked my door and walked down the hall. A neighbor passed with a laundry basket and asked if the storm would hit tonight. What storm? I said. She gestured vaguely toward the coast. They said it's coming in early. Heavy air. I told her I liked heavy air. She looked at me the way people look at peeled paint, sorrowful for what used to be underneath. In the car, I told myself a list of practical things about the house. Inspect joists, test outlets, gauge window light by hour. The list worked like a song you sing to drown another. But under 8, the other music persisted. 2 words hummed in a voice I knew too well my own, rearranged by echo. Not yet. On Sable Street, the gulls had given way to crows. They swaggered on the curb like men who want you to believe they aren't afraid of the ocean. The umbrella lay where I'd left it, leaning in the porch corner like a gentleman's cane. I opened the door and stepped into the foyer. The house inhaled. It wasn't sound. It was subtraction. The world outside narrowed to a slit of daylight that did not reach the floor. The temperature dropped the way it does when someone opens a crypt in a movie, and the director wants you to know the past is a meat locker. The wallpaper lungs seemed wider. On the whole table, my recorder blinked red. Oh, I had not turned it on. I told myself that I had chosen this, that all good locations bite back once before they pay rent. Okay, I said to the house. Show me what you do when the camera's rolling. From the basement door, a draft rose up like breath from someone standing too close. And somewhere, in a room whose doorway I had not yet found, something began to whisper in a voice that wasn't made of words at all, but of the spaces between them. The house did not move so much as it adjusted to me, the way an old coat will find your shoulders again after too many winters. I stood in the foyer and counted 10 breaths mine, nodded then took the recorder from the hall table. Its red light pulsed as if it had continued recording since yesterday of its own will. I clicked stop, then play, just to see what the house thought it had heard in my absence. At first, the track offered the music of empty architecture. A slow creak, a soft tick, the kind of sigh that requires age to perform properly. Then a more deliberate rhythm asserted itself. Not footsteps exactly, but a weight shifting from one idea to the next. In the background, faint as fog, a whisper rose and fell with the steadiness of surf. No words, just the shape of words. "Okay," I said aloud, more to the house than to the machine. "If we're collaborating, I need you to keep your ego out of the mix." The joke steadied my hands enough to work. I slipped the recorder into my breast pocket, opened my notebook, and began a second walkthrough with a different eye-less atmosphere. More evidence. The umbrella leaned where I'd left it. Water-stained cane held in a metal cuff like a throat. I passed the parlor without entering, saving it like a room in a dream you aren't ready to visit yet. In the dining room, the wallpaper changed pattern, trading tiny lungs for a procession of fish with mouths slightly open, as if perpetually preparing for a word. A long table stood against the wall, leaf folded, weighted with dust. Places had been set once long ago and never cleared. The ghosts of plates ringed the wood in circles lighter than the rest. At the head of the table, the chair's seat had split and puckered, a wound frozen mid-hip. The drawers in the sideboard resisted until I gave them a steadier pressure. Inside, someone had arranged spoons and knives by size left to right, largest to smallest, the way a child does when told to make it neat, without being told how. The forks were missing. In their trench, a slip of paper lay, folded twice, creased into memory. I opened it with the same care I had given yesterday's letter, expecting another imperative. Instead, there was a list. Exhale the water. Inhale the names. Listen to what remains. The handwriting was immaculate, an ancient feeling without actually being old. Careful block letters articulated by a person who believed something unseen might grade their penmanship. In the lower corner, in smaller script, someone had added, "If you take too much, you thin." I didn't know what thinning meant in this context, but the word made my scalp aware of itself. A breeze brushed the back of my neck. I closed the drawer and pivoted, expecting the front door to have drifted wider, but it remained only a thin rectangle of outside. The breeze had come from the hallway that led to the kitchen. I followed it. The kitchen was obediently as I had left it, except for one detail. On the counter beside the antique stove, 3 glass jars stood where there had been none yesterday. Each jar was empty, but each wore a label. Inhale, exhale, listen. The labels had been copied from the basement tags with the same disciplined hand as the paper in the sideboard. A clean cloth lay folded next to them, an invitation to decant air. I opened the first jar. It smelled faintly of nothing. Not a sterile nothing. Not glass and soap, but a tender vacancy, like the first second after a candle goes out. "Do you think I'm stupid?" I asked the house, jar in my hand like a solution. "Do you think I'll try to trap you?" The house did not answer, but the antique stove uttered a click from deep in its belly, a double syllable that could have been agreement or indigestion. Before I could decide what to do with the jars, the recorder in my pocket gave a soft electric cough and spoke in a voice I recognized. Mine from yesterday's saying basement. Appears to contain ritual markings. Then hung instructions. Then this part was. Knew my voice continued without the stutter of an edit. They don't work if you know you're reusing them. I hadn't said there. I would have remembered a sentence that tasted that much like a dare. I pulled the device out and watched the timestamp. The segment that never existed nestled itself between two that did. Seamless. Obedient to chronology the way a lie is obedient to need. "When it inhales," I said, "because the room expected language, what leaves with the breath from the living room or the room behind it? A room I hadn't mapped, yet came a small, bright sound. Like a spoon tapping glass. I followed the noise through a door I'd assumed led to a closet. It did not. It opened into a narrow corridor stitched between rooms. A little artery the builders had tucked in to keep a servant out of sight 100 years ago. The corridor ran alongside the parlor, then dog-legged and widened into a room not on the front elevation. A notch room, a concealed volume. It was small and square and damp at its corners. No windows, no light, until my phone's beam cut an angle into it. On the far wall, a set of shallow shelves bore only 3 objects. A glass bell jar large enough to cover a cake, a brass handbell with a handle polished by long fingers, and a small wooden box the size of an apology. I lifted the bell jar first. Inside, the air was dense with a smell so clean it frightened. Sea salt steeped in winter, the ghost of a lighthouse keeper's sweater. I put the jar down because when I lifted it, the room got lonelier. The handbell I rang once, its sound was bright and unbelievable, like ice speaking. The box there was a note slipped under its lid, the corner jutting like a tongue. It found, "Returned the mouth." "Where's your mouth?" I asked to the house. I didn't expect an answer, and I did not get one. Not in words, but the air in the square room cinched, an invisible belt tightening one notch. The list in my pocket, the letter in my bag, the jars labeled with imperatives all, suggested mouths in their habits. The house breathed. The house had lungs on its wallpaper. The house wanted to inhale. If I opened something, it might close something else in exchange. I left the note room as carefully as I had found it and, for the first time, went upstairs. The stair treads told their stories under my feet. This one had carried many heavy boxers up and fewer down. That one had learned the precise gait of a single child, then forgotten it. A runner had once grappled down the center and leached its dye into the grain. A ghost of pattern remained. Little diamonds, like scales, halfway up, a smear of what I wouldn't call blood seeped from under the baseboard in a dry dribble. It could have been It could have been iron expressing itself through wood. At the landing, daylight skinned in through a window so dirty it had evolved into a kind of frosted glass. Beyond it, clouds arranged themselves in rows like sleeping geese. The storm Mrs. Kent had gestured toward was gathering its argument. I opened doors. A bedroom with wallpaper of concentric circles that made the room feel like a ripple. A second bedroom with no wallpaper at all, just plaster that had cracked into the outline of a man leaning on his elbows. A third bedroom with nothing but a bed frame and a mirror with no glass, its frame intact, its void honest. In that room, I saw clearly that the house had painted over a door. The paint failed to disguise the underlying geometry, a rectangle out of ratio with the rest, a seam where there should have been consistency. I pressed until the paint gave a little. I found the tiniest lip of metal beneath, a hinge that had been told to forget. With the pocket knife I carry because sometimes the world needs gently prying open, I picked and scraped until the seam remembered it had been edges once. The door opened inward onto a narrow space, and a ladder. Attics have a different cold than basement. Basements are dense cold, old coin cold. Attics are dry cold, the kind a long-dead grandfather would have in his handkerchief drawer. I climbed. The ladder rattled and accepted me. The hatch delivered me to the top of the house under a roof that had been patched and repatched in the same unconvincing way. Light reached in through a row of little windows like missing teeth. Dust motes drifted with such purpose they could have been rehearsed. The widow's walk door was propped with a broken chair. Through the glass, I could see the harbor shouldering itself against weather. The roofline lifted and settled, a slow breath in shingles. Along the ridge beam, someone had tacked a line of little paper labels like the ones in the basement, but these were different. Each had a name written on it. Some were ordinary names: Ruth, Cal, Pennyand. Some were more like titles: Anchor, Hingemout. Every label had a small hole punched through the end and had been threaded on twine. The twine ran through a series of pulleys attached to the beam and down through the attic floor, as if the names could be lowered and raised on command. I touched one. Cal. The paper was soft and took the oil of my finger the way a cheek does. I looked for a date. There was none. But there was a smudge of ash pressed into the paper, a fingerprint rubbed into a circle. Not accidental. Beside Cal. The next tag, Red Pike. The property manager's name. I plucked at the twine, expecting it to resist with the pragmatism of rope. Instead, it answered with a subtle lift from below, as if I had raised a weight attached somewhere deeper base. I stopped pulling as one stops pulling a thread when the shirt one loves announces its willingness to become a rag. From the corner of the attic, something clicked. Not a machine. A cricket's old sorry cousin. Then the house took a breath so minute I might have mistaken it for my own, were it not for the way the twine shuddered along the names and the way my mouth filled with the taste of iron and brine. When it inhales, something leaves with the breath, I said, repeating the marginalia on the letter's back. What have you taken already? Memory is a deceitful archivist. It labels some drawers and shoves others under the bed. Still, I have always been able to retrieve my own middle name without effort, a stupid test I give myself in panic. I tried, there, in the attic. I reached for the syllable that sits between Avery and Lane. Nothing came, not a single sound. I thought of my mother saying my full name when she meant business, and hearing it through time, I was forced to replace the missing part with silence. Avery Lane, I said aloud, to anchor one end. The gap between the two words gaped, and into it rushed salt air and the smell of something snuffed. You don't get to have that, I told the house. Give it back. The attic offered an ethics lecture in timber. The twine hummed very slightly. I climbed down because confrontation requires footing, and attics are poor courts. On the second-floor landing, my phone vibrated an incoming call from a number I had saved as Pike. I answered because the label in the attic made an action feel like negligence. You inside? He asked. Gravel voice. As ever, wind worried his signal. Yes, don't lock the back door when you leave, he said. Inspector's coming tomorrow. Bank moved him up. The back door is sealed, I said, and listened for how he would answer. A pause. It was, he said, after the last folks. But I told you someone broke in. We resealed, then somebody unsealed again. It's a mouthy house. Likes to open what we close. Who's Cal? I asked. Dead, he said, too quickly, like he wanted the word to outrun the rest of the sentence. Long before my time. People say his name a lot around there. It sticks to the place. You find something with it on. The labels twitched in memory. You said only you and I have the code. That's still true. Then who's in the house when it inhales? He laughed to make the question small. Weather's coming in, he said instead. Watch the windows. They like to let themselves go. Were you the one who left the note in the sideboard? What note? The list. I said, exhale the water, inhale the names. Listen to what remains. You're making me regret this job, he said. Then softo, like a confession, he wanted to forget immediately. Dante say that second part out loud. Not even as a joke. The nameless silence. Then the line went dead, or he killed it. My phone registered no bars. Mrs. Kent had called the pending storm heavy air. Heavy air is greedy. It takes signal, takes sound, takes heat. I went room to secure windows that didn't want securing. In the second bedroom, the plaster man watched me with his negative, and when I pressed the sash down, the window answered with a sound like a stopped breath. In the third bedroom mirror void, painted over door now unpainted, the glass refused to lock, with the same stubborn humor I had used on my own panic. I told the window I liked its attitude and hammered the latch with the heel of my hand. It gave sulking. Back on the first floor, I stood again in the parlor. Because I could no longer not stand in the parlor. The rolled rug, the chandelier, the fireplace's black mouth. I tried to locate the gap between the beams I'd seen from beneath. They're a rectangle of less wood. I stood under it, not daring to lean over from above the way something had leaned yesterday, not because fear is noble, But because fear is sometimes the only honest measurement, the map watermark on the letter S back-nagged, like an itch you can find under a cast. I unfolded the page and held it to the window so that gray shorelight could interrogate it. The lines flared again. A square of streets, an intersection marked with an X. It was not Sable Street. It was 2 blocks east, near the seawall where water used to kiss land before developers lifted one and banked the other. I could go there. I should go there, but the house had inhaled just now, and the idea of turning my back on a breathing thing made my spine want friends. I checked my watch. The storm would bang down in an hour if the sky knew its own schedule. If I hurried, I could reach the marked intersection, see what left itself to be seen, and return before the house decided to teach me about presence and absence by making me an example. I texted Pike, stepping out to check a thing nearby. 10 minutes. No response. The red light on my recorder pulsed sympathetically with my heart. The intersection on the watermark was where a short street dead-ended into a brick wall, too earnest to be original. It had the look of something inserted during a moral panic to keep teenagers from kissing the sea. On the wall, behind a finicky quince bush, a square of lighter brick formed a subtle door shape. My pocket knife had already proved itself a conversationalist. I scraped mortar. The square loosened. It wasn't a door. It was a slot big enough to drink a letter. On impulse more than plan, I slid the folded note "Do not let the house inhale you" into the slot. It met no resistance and no audience. Just the damp, soft throat of brick turned hollow. The quince leaves trembled like gossip at a fence. Once the note disappeared, the wall exhaled a cooler breath than the air deserved. A small, private satisfaction pulsed muscle under skin as if the city had swallowed something it had been waiting for. On my phone, a new voice memo appeared without me opening the app. The file name was Listen. I pressed play. It was not my recording. It was a woman's voice, unsteady but determined, speaking as if her mouth had not been used for weeks. "If you find this," she said, "don't give it your name. It takes them as easily as it takes air." We moved in with 3, and by winter there were 2. Not dead, just hurt by forgetting. He stood by the sink and said, "I know you." And he did, but he couldn't say how. Names are bones. The memory. Without them, the body sits down and doesn't get up. I left the jars to trick it into keeping busy. It likes to label things. It likes rules, but it hates when you know you're playing along. There was a pause, a dry swallow. The recording's breathy quiet had the intimacy of someone sitting too close on a bench. "If you put the warning back in its mouth," she continued, "it will give you one thing in return. That's the rule. It exhales once for every inhale you catch. Take back what you're missing and leave." We tried to stay. We got thin. The file ended with a sound like a palm pressing against glass firm, then gone. I stood there with the quince in the sky growing a bruise in its gut, and felt for the absence again. My middle name drifted back like a rag you thought the tide had kept. I said it under my breath and it answered to me. The relief was so bodily I could have cried. I did not. The street had eyes, and I prefer my salt on the inside. On the walk back, the storm crossed the last polite distance and laid its hands on the city. Wind climbed the block on its knuckles. The house had not locked me out. The front door gave mouthwise, and I stepped in and put my body where I had been, because houses like consistency. Thank you, I said to no one, and to the woman who had recorded the memo, and to the concept of rules itself. Now we're even. The house inhaled. This time, I felt it articulate its ribs. The chandelier's chain straightened, the rolled rug's burlap tightened, the wallpaper lungs whitened in a gust, as if they had been startled. The umbrella slid 2 inches across the floorboards as though dragged by someone too weak to do more. From the kitchen came the sound of water negotiating pipes. Ordinary, except that the water was speaking in syllables. Inhale, exhale, listen. Not recorded, not hallucinated. Spoken in a small, wet mouth under the sink. I turned, but my feet did not. It took a moment to realize that the soles of my shoes had adhered to the floor by a film of something clear that had not been there. I looked down. The liquid shone thin as a decision you don't quite believe you've made. Now, a voice said from the parlor doorway. It was my voice again, but not a recording, and not an echo. It was the exact voice I use when a shot is right, and the actor has found their light. And every element of the scene has decided to cooperate. It was my voice from the future, or from a me that had chosen a moment I had not yet caught up to. Now? It said again, a small mercy dressed as instruction. Across the hall, the basement door stood ajar. I tried to lift one foot. The film stretched and argued. A transparent muscle, I thought, cut the shoes, and my hands acted, untying laces, stepping out of leather with the care of a dream that knows waking can be lost by a sudden move. Barefoot in a house that names. I told myself I was making a choice, not becoming one. The basement exhaled a breath that tasted like the first second of a storm. When the sky reminds you, it is an ocean turned upside down. The stairs waited like omissions. The recorder in my breast pocket pulsed red once, twice, then threw a tiny spark of its own accord and went dark. In the kitchen, the jars I had not touched answered with 3 tiny pops as their lids sealed themselves without hands. Now, said the voice from the doorway a 3rd time, almost kind, and in its kindness, I heard something behind it, the way you hear the sea behind the applause when a ship comes in with more flags than it left with. I took the first step down. The chalk circles had blurred, not from time, but from breath. The labels inhale, exhale. Listen stirred, though no draft moved. And in the center of the room where the trapdoor had lain flush with the floor, a seam widened, hinges remembering their names. It lifted. Black water showed itself in the crack knot, basement, seep knot, groundwater. A surface like a pupil reflecting a small, pale face I did not recognize until it blinked. And I understood that it was mine, seen through a different weather. The house inhaled a 4th time, and something behind me put its palm lightly between my shoulder blades, not pushing, not yet only, measuring how much pressure would be required. When now stopped being a suggestion and became a rule, the trapdoor yawned wider. Hinges groaned in a language older than carpentry. The water in the pit reflected a version of me that didn't quite match. My hair a fraction darker, my eyes carrying shadows they hadn't yet earned. When I raised my hand, the reflection hesitated before following, as though waiting for permission. The palm at my back remained steady, not urgent, not cruel, patient, like a hand guiding a child to take its first step. I told myself to resist, but resistance requires a ground to push against. And the house had been sanding down that ground since the letter first crossed my door. Now, the voice repeated. It came from everywhere: the parlor, the ceiling, the twine of names in the attic, even the jar lids in the kitchen. My own voice, borrowed and bent. The house didn't want to argue. It wanted me to agree. I crouched at the trapdoor's edge, the wood damp under my fingertips. The black water moved with a tide that was not this city's, rising and falling in breaths too deliberate to be accident. Each exhale whispered faint words that brushed the edge of hearing. Names, maybe, or fragments of memory it had inhaled and kept. I leaned closer. The surface swelled as though scenting me. I remembered the woman's recording. If you put the warning back in its mouth, it will give you one thing in return. I had already done that at the seawall, and it had returned my missing name. That transaction should have closed the account, but accounts that are mouths have different arithmetic. The palm at my back pressed slightly harder. My balance listed reflexively. I dropped the recorder into the water, thinking maybe it could take my place. The device struck the surface, sank without a ripple, as though falling into another dimension of density. A moment later, my voice rose from the pit, not from the recorder, but from the water itself. It spoke a sentence I had never said. Avery Lane belongs here, the words folded into the rafters. The chalk circles flared white, then dimmed. Not yet, I whispered, echoing the voice from the first recording. My reflection smiled, sympathetic. Its lips moved without sound. Then it extended a hand upward, palm open, asking me to clasp it. I leaned back instead of forward. The palm at my back stiffened. Surprised, I shoved against it, spinning around to face what had touched me. Nothing. No body. Just the air arranged into pressure, but the chalk circles trembled as though amused by my refusal. I took a step toward the stairs. The air thickened, resisting. The labels inhale, exhale. Listen rattled in their strings. One tore loose and floated down like a feather. I caught it. The paper was warm, as if recently exhaled. In block letters it read, "Choose, choose, what?" I asked, my throat raw. The pit answered. My reflection split in two. One, Avery with weary eyes who seemed to have given in, sinking calmly below the surface. And one, Avery with clenched jaw, face tilted toward a narrow shaft of light that pierced down from the cracks in the beams. Both waited for me. The house inhaled again. Dust fled upward. Boards flexed. The water rose, its black lip brushing the floorboards. It wanted me to fall, to decide by absence of choice. No, I said. You don't inhale me. I exhale you. I grabbed the warm paper and tore it into strips, scattering them into the water. The surface rippled, confused. The reflection fractured into a dozen versions of me, each muttering different words. One wept. One laughed. One begged. The cacophony made the house falter, the inhale stuttering into a cough. The pit drew back slightly, the tide retreating, seizing the chance. I bolted up the stairs, barefoot, splinters biting butt. Welcome pain meant body. Body meant here. The door slammed behind me, but not before the pit exhaled once more. A cold mist raced up the steps and coated the walls. In the wallpaper lungs, the vines writhed, curling around pale alveoli. The front door loomed like salvation. But salvation in a breathing house is never free. The umbrella lay toppled, the lock stuck for half a second too long. When it yielded, the storm outside shoved its way in, rain driving sideways, sky fractured by lightning. I ran through it, half expecting the house to reel me back like a hooked fish. It didn't. The door shut behind me with a sigh almost tender. On Sable Street, the storm clawed gutters, ripped shingles, made the world forget it had once been orderly. I staggered to the car and collapsed inside, dripping salt water that didn't taste like rain. My phone lit with another new file. Exhale, WAV. Against my better judgment, I pressed play. It was my own voice again, but gentler. You've left, it said. But leaving isn't enough. It will follow. It always follows its own air. You can't keep breathing and not expect a share. Static filled the rest. The file ended on a faint chuckle that wasn't mine. For days, I tried to file the report as if the house were only architecture. Foundations sound. Stairs need reinforcement. Atmosphere suitably. But every time I typed, the words rearranged. Basement mouth. Inhale. Exhale. Choose. The sentences erased themselves like lungs, expelling smoke. My notebook pages curled inward, edges crisping though no flame touched them. The jars I had left on the kitchen counter at home sealed themselves one morning. Each bore a new label in that disciplined hand. Sleep, eat, remember. I smashed them. Glass flew. Air fled. But I still don't know whether it was mine that escaped. Weeks later, I passed by Sable Street. The house stood intact. Windows polite, porch damp. A for sale sign leaned in the yard. Its letters glistened as if freshly painted. Beneath the agent's number, someone had scrawled in pencil, "Do not let the house inhale you." I didn't stop. Didn't take photos. Didn't breathe until the block was behind me. But when I pulled into my own building's lot, there was a letter on my doormat folded twice. No stamp, no seal, no name. The paper smelled faintly of salt and smoke. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. 7 words, the same as before, but this time, one had changed. Do not let the house exhale you.